Welcome in a series of short interviews. We try to get an impression of the dynamics in the field of pilgrimages in Europe. And the label of our project is Reinventing Pilgrimage in Europe. Today, our guest is Dr. Nick Mayhew-Smith. He's a writer and researcher on religious heritage, church history, and Celtic theology. And he's also a former journalist of the Financial Times, if I'm well informed. And he's really an expert on British pilgrimage. For many, many years, he's visiting and studying sacred places in the UK and brings together his findings in publications for a broad public in what we can call guides. And I mention explicitly his book from 2011, British Holiest Places, and in 2020, his magnus opus was published. Some call it the second edition of the Holiest Places Guide, the standard work on British pilgrim paths and places written together with Guy Hayward of the British Pilgrimage Trust. The book is called Britain's Pilgrim Places. Dr. Mayhew-Smith, welcome in our series interviews. And perhaps we can start with that book, that guide of more than 600 pages. It's about places organized in regions of the UK, but also about pilgrim paths. It reflects, I think, both your work and that of the British Pilgrimage Trust. And it gives, beside an enormous amount of information on what is called sacred places, also the state of affairs on routes and paths as it's now. It's an enormous network. It offers those sacred sites as a sacred geography all over the UK. Let us start with the relation between sites, places, and pilgrim paths. In your case, there was, I think, first a fascination for sacred sites and landscape, and after contact perhaps with the British Pilgrimage Trust, also in pilgrimage. Am I right?
That's exactly right, and that's a very accurate introduction as well. That lays the ground perfectly for us. Yes, I began my work looking at sacred places in Britain, and I travelled to around maybe 700 holy sites in the whole length and breadth of Britain. So a very big kind of research project. And I have to say personally, having spent all that time on the road traveling to see these places, I was slightly less interested in the idea of pilgrimage and more in the idea of not driving or traveling and actually being and enjoying these specific places. So that partly kind of emerged as a book looking at the sites rather than the journeying. However, of course, there are no visits to sites without the journey too. And it was later on the British Pilgrimage Trust, partly inspired by the work that was generated from my first book and a TV series, they sat down and thought about how they could encourage people to go and visit these places, which, as I say, was something I hadn't really thought about early on in great detail. So if you like, there's two sides. There's the places, and then there's pilgrimage, which threads them together, which puts that kind of river of life, that flow of traffic, which encourages people to get out and go and see. So if you like, it's that there are two sides to pilgrimage, and I've sort of hold those intentions slightly in my research and my writing. There's the journey, and then there's the place.
Yeah. I was also intrigued by the subtitle of your book. The subtitle is The Complete Guide to Every Spiritual Treasure. Spiritual treasures, what do you mean by that?
There I would be really, to define a holy place, all I did was very simply go back and look at which places have been sanctified by tradition, which have been marked out by a history of devotional use. So it's really been places which are defined almost by the simply by the kind of popular appeal over the centuries. So I wasn't trying to define it any more closely than that. I wasn't trying to say, well, this is a holy place because it's a place of Catholic persecution, and this isn't a holy place because it's whatever, a site that emerged later from the Reformation. I wasn't trying to be at all discriminatory. I was just saying, where has anybody gone of any kind of long story to go and make meaningful connections to a place, to a landscape. And then that does beg a lot of questions as a researcher. What exactly do people do at holy places to make them holy? What are the rituals that bind people to place, that make those meaningful connections? So it does open up a lot of questions, which I've continued to research ever since.
Yeah. The first book was published in 2011.
Yeah.
Was it pioneer work, or was it a lot of interest in the UK for places of pilgrimage? So how recent is this interest in sacred places, sacred landscape, and pilgrimage in the UK?
I think it's very much what I've seen really is the revival of, and let's be quite specific here, of say shrines in cathedrals, which were the kind of high medieval idea of pilgrimage destinations. That really surprised me. I went to a lot of cathedrals on my journeys, and it's around more than a dozen cathedrals had rebuilt their shrines, and in many cases put back in a relic of the saint. So you've got St Albans Cathedral in, I think, 2003, rebuilt their medieval shrine after 500 years, and then found, were given a bone of St Alban. This is our first martyr in Britain. This is a Roman era martyr. And they put the bone back in to the shrine with great ceremony. And it was like what we'd seen as a very quiet unwinding of an enormous tradition, you know, the kind of destruction of relics and the banning of pilgrimage and the Reformation was being quietly reversed. And it was amazing. There was no real outcry. No one had really spotted this as a thing. But in the last, say, 20, 25 years, these cathedrals have been busy putting back in these sites. And I don't, you know, I was really quite heartened by it to see that they were respecting the past, and they were kind of undoing some of the extreme reactions of our history. And these places were starting to attract visitors again as well. People were coming. So I think it's certainly, you could say, in the last 20, 25 years, the cathedral shrines are now back, and there were really virtually none of them of any note back before then. So that's definitely been a phenomenon I've observed.
Yeah, if I'm right, the historical dimension, the historical grounds of relics and sacred places and sacred landscape, that's a very important element in the rediscovering of that past. So it's not so much reinventing or inventing of tradition, but it's really looking for historical grounds.
Yes, it is. I have heard one theory which was said, and this was actually by Archbishop Vincent Nichols, who's head of the Roman Catholic Church here in England, and he said that the moment when the British people began kind of the collective mourning again was the death of Princess Diana, Princess of Wales, when we had this huge outpouring of shock and grief, and there were these great sea of flowers were placed outside her home to commemorate her death. And he said for him that was the moment when the Reformation ended. And I mean, if you look at it, he's more or less right. That does coincide with the way we've regained our shrines and so on. So the idea that you can mourn communally and collectively hold grief for a public figure, and that not being seen as too Catholic or whatever, but to be guided and shaped in a sort of positive way. So I think there is an element of that. It was an interesting theory anyway. You'd have to study it more, but certainly it did have a profound effect on Britain, the way we grieved in a communal way, which is kind of what a shrine is. It's a kind of place where a public figure you don't really know personally, but you go to their grave and you pay respects. So that is a thing that has kind of come back into our landscape.
Mm-hmm. you were talking about the cathedrals. Is it primarily a matter of the Church of England or the Catholic Church, or is it also the interest in what we can call pre-Christian landscapes? And what is it a top-down church, religious, institutional religious initiative, or is it a broader process?
That's an extremely good question, and I think it's it drives both ways. I think people do have a kind of instinct to go out into nature and make some meaningful connections, and that has taken many shapes. It is the kind of a kind of New Age paganism is one kind of quite acute expression of that, but other people more generally feel the need to get up and go out and sort of rediscover old walking routes and old ways and old places to visit. So I think there is a kind of revival which the church cannot mediate, the church cannot own and cannot direct. And in the case of neo-paganism and so on, it's people are finding new expressions for that old impulse to connect to place. So there's that on the one hand. There is this kind of free-form pilgrimage, and I would say that the revival of pilgrimage now that we're seeing is more along those lines of kind of spiritual heritage, mental health and well-being. And I know the British Pilgrimage Trust has researched and found that the number one driver for people is mental and physical well-being, whereas going to visit a shrine, a holy place, is quite far down their list of reasons why people go on pilgrimage. So the church can certainly capture some of that enthusiasm, but it's not primarily driven by a devotion to the shrines being revived. I think it goes with it, but I would say that probably the footfall, the popular interest and enthusiasm to go and to visit and connect, is what has come first in this.
Yeah. You were mentioning the walking culture. So it's my impression that perhaps the walking culture, the hiking and the trails, also tourism itself is perhaps invented in Britain. And many historians mention the famous Lake District visitors as the origin of tourism and walking culture. What is the difference or the interference between this walking tradition and the rediscovering of the pilgrim paths?
I think there is very much a walking culture here, and a lot of nature writing and the poets and so on, and the Lake District is, as you completely right, is a place of kind of romantic resort for poetry and so on. And you can even trace that back earlier, all the way through into kind of in Ireland as well, which is obviously very close to Britain. There's a Celtic culture, a very strong celebration of nature, even back in the first millennium. A lot of writings which glory at the wonder of animal life and nature. So there is a sort of strong romantic attachment to the natural world. And then I think the walking routes really that we have here have been very well kind of revived and restored over the decades. We have something like the National Trust, which doesn't really have an equivalent in many other countries, which is almost like a kind of secular outpouring of affection for nature and the natural world. And I would put very much, when I'm looking at pilgrimage in a British context, I would really put the National Trust in there as a big thing and say this is, a non-governmental organization that's extremely powerful, that owns a huge amount of land in Britain and has put an enormous effort into opening up walking paths, coastal paths, and they're fantastic at encouraging people to go out. And it's almost as if they've taken on the role of the church in preserving and almost venerating landscapes and allowing people access to them. So I think that is if you block off a public affection like pilgrimage did, it'll find new ways, that instinct, to come out. So I would say there very much that the kind of National Trust has helped drive and keep alive this love. And the National Trust owns vast amounts of the Lake District, for example, and it's quite controversial, but they do, they maintain the walking trails and so on. So I think that's, that runs alongside the church's own smaller work in this field.
Yeah. So perhaps we can say so, the National Trust is a secular organization or body that has the national trails, that is the walking and hiking culture, and the British Pilgrimage Trust is the more pilgrimage variant of that, or?
Yes, I think that's right. And I think the British Pilgrimage Trust is very much working along the same lines, but it wants to be more explicit that there are meaningful, positive and healthy ways that you can connect by going out and walking. So it's like, it's kind of in the way that the National Trust can't really talk too much about the spiritual benefits and so on, because it has to represent everybody. The British Pilgrimage Trust can look, and does very well, at looking gently at the kind of connections you can make to nature, but not coming from a church point of view. And I think that's really important, the way it's managed to sit between the formal church, which in the past certainly has kind of managed pilgrimage and turned it into a big kind of economy of salvation, people going down the great pilgrim routes, coming to the shrines and so on. So I think the British Pilgrimage Trust is aware that you need to give a very diffuse sense of making, you know, personal, mental, physical kind of health benefits from getting out and seeing places and finding those rich heritage connections there. It sits well between those worlds, and it's done very well in kind of creating this sort of place for that instinct to be shaped.
Yeah. So there is that focus in your work on places and shrines, but in the introduction of your 2020 book, I read an interesting part on the human being as a nomad, and that is a connection, and that is put in connection with the traveling of the pilgrim. Can you elaborate perhaps a little bit on that nomad human being element?
That's a really important point. Thank you for that, because it became the subject of my PhD, was to look at the origins of pilgrimage. And certainly in a British context, the word pilgrim, peregrinatio is pilgrimage in the Latin, where it's first used, it doesn't mean leaving home, going to a shrine and coming back again down a kind of transport corridor. So that's a later medieval idea. The first word, when it's used, means something more close to an exile or a wanderer, a wayfarer, a stranger on the road. It was used to describe. Bede, for example, used the word only to refer to people who left the shores of Britain and went around traveling. So it was a sense of being dislocated from home, going out there into the natural world, and not doing what we would consider a pilgrimage now, a kind of corridor transport thing. So it's very much a wandering. And in their wanderings, certainly the early church and Celtic spirituality and Anglo-Saxon missionaries and so on put an awful lot of energy into going out into nature and doing things like praying by the sea, going into caves, climbing mountains, going into wilderness areas, ringing handbells and so on. I'm kind of going out in not a linear way to go into nature, to go to a shrine and back. They went kind of from the church outwards into the most remote parts of the landscape. And there, what my PhD studied really was to look at why they did that. And it became clear to me that their journeys from the church outwards, kind of like a diffusion, if you like, into the landscape, was very much taking the sacraments of the church into the natural world and demonstrating that they were valid and that they worked. You know, even by a seashore, the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon missionaries would wade into the sea and perform rituals. And I looked at those very carefully, and I realized that they were based on baptism rituals. Equally, they would share bread with animals, which was a kind of Eucharist. They would forgive animals who had stolen thatch from their cottages. And it was like a sacrament of reconciliation. And so all the way through, I looked and saw that really they were trying to suffuse all of creation with a sense of the sacred. So rather than, if you like, it was almost opposite to what we understand a pilgrimage. Rather than going into a church for your sacred experience, your shrine, your prayers, your healing, they would go out from the church and take that spirituality and the rituals of the church with them and perform. You know, they would go to caves and islands, and they would perform exorcisms, make the sign of the cross and anoint with oil the waves, which people didn't do that in other parts of Christendom. They would exorcise human beings, but here they were kind of like converting the landscape, if you like. So pilgrimage really began as this kind of nature connection and wandering. And I think now, as it's coming back, it retains a little element of that, going out into nature in a kind of devout, kind of intentional way.
Yeah, and that brings in current pilgrimage the importance of landscape and nature.
Yeah.
So we are also talking about pilgrimage and shrines and sacred sites beyond the institutional religion. You were involved some years ago in a BBC documentary, and that was called Pagans and Pilgrims. Why that title?
Well, that was the BBC. My book really, because it looks at our recorded and written history and heritage, it tends to focus on Christianity, but the BBC decided they were going to go for pagans and pilgrims. And they were very cautious about doing anything about Christianity, supposedly. And they thought it was going to be quite controversial to do a whole program about pilgrimage places and so on. In the end, they kind of softened it and made it pagans and pilgrims and so on, and tried not to be overly Christian. In the end, we did this 6-part television series, and we had no controversy, no complaints. People loved it. We were showing beautiful landscapes with a great old story attached to them, and the public loved it. It did very, very well. We had a high viewing figures, and lots of good write-up in the media. No one was saying, well, you shouldn't be promoting Christianity. The opposite, people were saying, we've opened this up, we've kind of, this is a whole world we can go and we can explore. And I've had that comment on my books as well. It's actually we're kind of saying to people, here are these great places, you go and you make your own story on top of them. So you're not following in a kind of set heavy duty top-down ritual behavior. You're not coming into a shrine to meet a priest to confess your sins. You're going out there and you're making your own stories, and I think that approach is the modern one, and that's what allows people to connect again to these places. It's the kind of experiential turn, if you like, that some academics refer to, the idea of going and having life-enhancing experiences. That doesn't work if it's being managed or directed by a top-down institution such as the church. People like to go and have that sense of freedom. So I think we've managed to capture and give people that.
I would like to bring in one more team before we end this interesting interview about pilgrimage in the UK. Everywhere in Europe, when we have interviews about developments on pilgrimages, we talk about the Camino, the enormous influence of the road to Santiago de Compostela. What's the situation with the Camino in the UK? Is it also an influential element? Some scholars are talking about Caminoization of pilgrimage in Europe. Do you see that process also in the UK?
Yes, the word Camino started to be used to some of the kind of it's debatable whether the pilgrim routes that are appearing now are revivals or whether they're new inventions. There's always a bit of both. There's a certain amount of magic going into creating a pilgrim route. But yes, definitely, that phrase is being used, and there are things like pilgrim passports being set up for encouraging people to go to cathedrals. And the British Pilgrimage Trust has worked hard to open up again something like the Old Way, which is a very old route, which certainly ran along the south coast to Canterbury, an alternative way to get to Canterbury, the great shrine of Thomas Becket there, Canterbury Cathedral. And it's worked very hard to develop the route again and to make a map people can follow, and to offer accommodation suggestions and signposting as well, so people know that they're on the right path. So there is a very much a drive to kind of make known named routes, and that's been going on in Britain for at least 30 years. People have been trying to revive routes, and I suppose in a way before then the Pilgrim's Way was I can get you details on that. That was kind of rediscovered over 100 years ago. That was the first big one when the Pilgrim's Way was kind of put back onto the map, and people started going on that. So yeah, I think there is a drive to make it better signposted, better promoted, and with kind of infrastructure around it, like a passport and accommodation that's specifically geared for the walkers on that route.
Okay. So at the end of this interview, perhaps there is one thing, an aspect we did not address, but that's important for you to mention.
I think probably for me, that pilgrimage, it's actually, it's a slight mistake to think that holiness and spiritual significance are always somewhere else. And the idea of pilgrimage has kind of built in this idea that you need to go somewhere else in order to experience the divine. And I think probably what I've looked at over the years is that nearly every pilgrim place, there's a couple of exceptions, but nearly all of them were places where local people did something first of all, and then the pilgrims started to come later on. So nearly every holy place and destination are where local things were happening. So I think there is a for me anyway, there's a need to celebrate the local on a day when we've got petrol shortages in Britain and there's not much driving going on. It's good to remember you can go out into your local landscape and also have those great experiences on your doorstep.
Yeah, and that's also the case in the Corona pandemic. So the British Pilgrimage was organizing small walks around churches and local cathedrals. Okay, many thanks for this very interesting interview, and success with your work.
Thank you.